Hello everybody and welcome back to class. Today we're looking at the executive. So typically speaking, when we talk about the structure of government, we talk about our government having three branches. And those branches are the judiciary, the executive, and the legislature. So we've already talked about the judiciary. This week and next week we're moving on to the executive and the legislature. So I'll stop you there. Be sure to have read chapter 6, pages 114 to 127, so not a big reading this week. And also, please go to the question of the week. So your question of the week is just to scribble out your thoughts on what you think is the difference, the structural difference between the US government and the Canadian government. So how do these two governments operate differently? How is their structure different? Who has more power in those governments? So take a pause here and then get that stuff done, do your reading, do your question of the week, and we'll move on to our lecture. So your textbook will tell you that the executive is defined as a broad term that refers to the institutions, personnel, and behaviors of governmental power. In modern times, executives are the organizational center of political systems. So that's the key in this definition, is that they are the organizational center of political systems. Now, the way the Canadian government is organized is much different than the way that the US government is organized. In fact, if we were to draw a hierarchical chart of those systems, the person at the very top of those hierarchical charts of those executives would be two different people. Do you know who sits at the very tip top of the hierarchical chart of the Canadian executive system? In fact, it is the Queen. In the British North America Act of 1867, when Canada was established, it was stated that executive government and authority of and over Canada is vested in the Queen. We did not change this system. The US, however, did change that system. Have you ever heard of the Boston Tea Party? It's a term that many of us know, but many of us don't know exactly what it meant or what the roots of that were or how that event, the Boston Tea Party, shaped the way the US government would become and become different from the Canadian government. So I'm going to show you a video. It's approximately 3 minutes and 30 seconds long. It's animated and it gives a very clear idea of the time in which Canada's political system and the US's political system diverged and the US created a different system. So here we go.
You've probably heard of the Boston Tea Party, something about a bunch of angry colonists dressed as Native Americans throwing chests of tea into the water. But the story is far more complicated, full of imperial intrigue, corporate crisis, smuggling, and the grassroots origins of the American Revolution. The first thing you need to know about tea in the 1700s is that it was really popular. In England, each man, woman, and child consumed almost 300 cups of the stuff every year. And since the English colonized America, Americans were crazy about tea too. By the 1760s, they were drinking over 1 million pounds of tea every year. So, when Britain wanted to increase taxes on tea in America, people were not happy, mostly because they had no say in tax decisions made in London. Remember that famous phrase, no taxation without representation? The American colonists had long believed that they were not subject to taxes imposed by legislature in which they lacked representation. In fact, rather than paying the taxes, they simply dodged the tax collectors. Since the east coast of America is hundreds of miles long and British enforcement was lax, about 3/4 of the tea Americans were drinking was smuggled in, usually from Holland. But the British insisted that Parliament did have the authority to tax the colonists, especially after Britain went deeply into debt fighting the French in the 7 Years' War. To close the budget gap, London looked to Americans, and in 1767 imposed new taxes on a variety of imports, including the Americans' beloved tea. America's response? No thanks. They boycotted the importation of tea from Britain, and instead brewed their own. After a new bunch of British customs commissioners cried to London for troops to help with tax enforcement, things got so heated that the Redcoats fired on a mob in Boston, killing several people in what was soon called the Boston Massacre. Under the terms of the 1773 Tea Act, Parliament cooked up a new strategy. Now the East India Company would sell the surplus tea directly through hand-picked consignees in America. This would lower the price to consumers, making British tea competitive with the smuggled variety while retaining some of the taxes. But the colonists saw through the British ploy and cried, "Monopoly!" Now it's a cold and rainy December 16, 1773. About 5,000 Bostonians are crowded into the Old South Meeting House, waiting to hear whether new shipments of tea that have arrived down the harbor will be unloaded for sale. When the captain of one of the ships reported that he could not leave with his cargo on board, Sam Adams rose to shout, "This meeting can do no more to save the country." Cries of "Boston Harbor a teapot tonight" rang out from the crowd, and about 50 men, some apparently dressed as Native Americans, marched down to Griffin's Wharf, stormed aboard 3 ships, and threw 340 tea chests overboard. An infuriated British government responded with the so-called Coercive Acts of 1774, which, among other things, closed the port of Boston until the locals compensated the East India Company for the tea. That never happened. Representatives of the colonies gathered at Philadelphia to consider how best to respond to continued British repression. This First Continental Congress supported destruction of the tea, pledged to support a continued boycott, and went home in late October 1774, even more united in their determination to protect their rights and liberties. The Boston Tea Party began a chain reaction that led with little pause to the Declaration of Independence and a bloody rebellion, after which the new nation was free to drink its tea, more or less, in peace.
So, unlike the US, Canada did not overthrow its colonial ruler. It in fact absorbed them into our current system. So when we talk about the powers of the crown, although the Queen does sit atop our hierarchical chart, which makes it look like she's the most important person or the most powerful person within the Canadian executive, that is not in fact true, because our monarch, the Queen, mainly is responsible for ceremonial duties. So the way it's distinguished is that the monarch reigns but does not govern. Nonetheless, the Queen does have what we call a prerogative authority. So that is to say that the powers of the monarch are not bypassed by the Constitution or other law. So as it stands in Canada, the Queen remains atop of that system. Now you may have noticed that the Queen doesn't spend a whole lot of time here in Canada, and that's because she has representatives. And when I talk about the crown, as opposed to the Queen, when I say the crown, what that means, the crown is comprised of 2 things. It's comprised of the Queen, but it's also comprised of her representatives. So the Queen has representatives at both official levels of government. At the federal level, she has the Governor General of Canada, and currently the Governor General of Canada is an astronaut named Julie Payette. At the provincial level, in each of the provinces, the Queen also has a representative, and they are called the Lieutenant Governor Generals, or I should say the Lieutenant Governors General. So in Canada, that is Elizabeth Dowdeswell. Now, from what we've seen from Elizabeth Dowdeswell, she tends to represent a more traditional Queen's representative. So very much non-political, very much ceremonial in her duties. Whereas we've seen a bit of a shift with the Governor General, Julie Payette, who has been stating some of her political values quite publicly. So it's an interesting shift that we'll be watching in the current political system. So what do these representatives do on behalf of the Queen? In other words, what are the Crown's powers? Well, of course, her representatives represent the Queen, but also they call a new parliamentary session into order, as we'll talk a little bit more about next week. They also allow for the end of a parliamentary session, and they can, if requested by the Prime Minister, dissolve the government and allow for a new election to be held. Beyond that, and again, we'll talk about this next week, each and every law that we pass in our legislative systems require royal assent. In other words, the Crown needs to approve these laws. Finally, they give medals. So some of our more prestigious awards in Canada, like medals of military merit or the Order of Canada. And as well, of course, the Queen links us with a series of many other nations in what we call the Commonwealth. So these are all nations that have also maintained the Queen as the head of their governments. Now, of course, British rule has not always been benign and ceremonial. There was quite a presence from the British government and quite a lot of input into how the Canadian colony would be run. But after the creation of Canada through the British North America Act and throughout the years following that, we did see an erosion of the power of the Crown. So we saw the British government give up much of its powers. The major documents that refer to those, and you'll recall this is one of our constitutional documents, is in 1931 with the Statute of Westminster, when Britain acknowledged that it wouldn't make laws anymore for Canada, so Canada would make its own laws. Further to that, in 1947, there was something called the Letters Patent that required representatives of the Queen to exercise powers on the advice of Canadian ministers. So where we see a shift in that relationship, where the representatives of the Crown take advice from the ministers and not vice versa. So why don't we just get rid of the Crown? Well, that's a really important question and an interesting one too. There was a survey done in 2017, a survey of over 1,000 Canadians, and the question was asked whether or not we should abolish the Crown after the death of Queen Elizabeth. And in fact, 43% of Canadians said no, don't abolish the Crown. 41% said yes, do so, and 16% said they didn't know. We have had political leaders in the past who have felt very strongly that this is something that Canada should do. And Pierre Elliott Trudeau was one of those people. Not surprising, since he is the father of our Constitution. He's the one whose efforts repatriated the Constitution or brought the Constitution home to Canada in 1982. In fact, this is an historic photo of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, and what you don't see in this picture is that the Queen had visited Canada, and she is currently in this photo walking up the stairs to get into an airplane. And then Pierre Elliott Trudeau does this garish kind of pirouette that was meant to signal, good, we're glad you're leaving. Which doesn't sound like a huge deal, I realize, but in the context of the way the Queen is typically treated, this was fairly unprecedented. So back to the question of why have we not abolished the Crown? It seems to be probably the most simple answer to that complicated question is that we can't be bothered. There just doesn't seem to be the political will that would be required to go through the process of reshaping the Canadian political system to remove the Crown and to take us out of the Commonwealth. Not to mention the fact that we do benefit from having good ties with England, of course, but we also benefit from being members of a club that is called the Commonwealth. So it seems at this point that there aren't that many gains to be had from abolishing the Crown, and there are some significant diplomatic losses that could come from doing so. Of course, the executive is not only made up of the Crown. This is a hierarchical chart of the executive, And we see at the very top the Queen, then her representative, the Governor General, at least in the federal system. And these two comprise what we call the Crown. But of course, the person with the most actual power in our political system is the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister within the executive is aided by a cabinet that helps him or her execute his or her vision, as well as a Prime Minister's office that is comprised of, a variety of assistants in helping the Prime Minister, do his or her job. So again, back to the question of, I asked you for the question of the week to reflect on the difference between the Canadian system and the United States system. So we've established that the Canadian system has a monarchy. We're a constitutional monarchy, whereas the US got rid of their monarch. But let's also talk about the difference between the Prime Minister and the President of the United States. And there's a video that I find really illustrative in terms of describing these differences. It's a little bit old, so it was done at the time that Barack Obama was president, but nonetheless, this fast-talking person does a good job of describing the main differences between those two different positions, and he also addresses which of those positions has more power than the other.
Germany's president announced that he would not serve a second term. This has little implication for the people, as Germany, like most countries in the world, allots most power to its chancellor, or prime minister. So why do some countries have both a president and a prime minister, and what is the difference between the two? Well, to start, the powers and responsibilities of presidents and prime ministers vary, as different countries follow different government infrastructures. But in general, the distinction can be found in their respective paths to power. Presidents are typically elected by the people, whereas prime ministers are usually elected by a legislative body of which they are already a member. Another important distinction is their position in the political system. Presidents are usually heads of state, which means they hold the highest-ranking political position and act as the official representative of that country. Prime ministers, on the other hand, are known as heads of government, as they solely oversee the legislative body they were elected by. And unlike presidents, prime ministers can take on more than one role. For instance, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is also the Minister of Communications, the Economy, the Interior, Foreign Affairs, and Regional Cooperation, while Israel's president can only act as the head of state. But in certain countries without PMs, like the United States, Brazil, and South Africa, presidents act as both head of state and head of government. Most countries have either a president or prime minister, which can also be called a chancellor, premier, or chief executive. But some have both, with one holding considerably less power. This is true in Germany, where the president has a limited role in everyday politics and instead serves as a figurehead at official gatherings and in matters of international law. In fact, his role is not unlike that of the Queen of England, as both are considered heads of state and are tasked with appointing the prime minister, or in Germany's case, the chancellor. So which position is more powerful? Well, in a system that has both, there is no question that the prime minister holds more power. But when compared to the president of the United States, the answer isn't so cut and dry. One could argue that prime ministers are more powerful, as they don't have the same checks and balances that the US president does. For instance, in the United Kingdom, the PM can appoint, dismiss, and otherwise shuffle around cabinet members and ministers. By comparison, the US Senate has the power to impeach a president, while the president cannot remove individual members of Congress. What's more, a PM's power is not offset by other branches of government, unlike the US president, whose power is checked and balanced by the legislative and judicial branches. Today, most countries appoint a prime minister to their most powerful office rather than a president, but whatever their title may be, there is no question that both positions are extraordinarily powerful. Most countries have long since developed.
So to reiterate those key differences, the president is elected by the people and becomes the head of state. The president is not part of the legislature. Therefore, the president doesn't choose the cabinet, because those individuals in the Canadian system are actually members of the legislature. In Canada, we don't vote for our prime minister. Our prime minister is the leader of the winning party. And therefore, our prime minister is also embedded within the legislature. So our prime minister can pick his favorite people, his team, to become the cabinet. I'll talk about that in a moment. A really big difference is that as part of the legislature, our prime minister is one of the people who is voting for or against laws, and therefore if they are a member to the winning party, that can be easier for them to pass laws. The president is apart from that system, so the legislature may have gone through the whole process of creating a law, but the president has veto power. So if he, maybe one day she, doesn't like a law, he can simply say no, and it's killed. Our prime minister, finally, can serve for as long as the people continue to elect, the local people continue to elect him or her, and so long as that party remains in leadership, that prime minister could theoretically remain in that position for the rest of his or her life. Whereas with the president, he can only serve a maximum of 2 terms, equaling 8 years. So some pretty big differences there. As for who has more power, well, that is a very tricky question. So our prime minister tends to have powers of representation. So in other words, our prime minister represents us within a global context. So whether that's making treaties with other countries, whether that is forging diplomatic ties, whether that's deciding whether to send our country to war, those would be under the prime minister. The prime minister also has the power to simply dissolve the entire the entire legislative body, and that puts us into an election to create a new legislative body. So that is an interesting difference as well with the Canadian system. The US election is held at the same time every 4 years. However, in Canada, if the polls are showing that the prime minister is heavily favored at a period of time, even if he has only been in office for 2 years or 3 years, he can ask the Crown to dissolve government and hold an election at that time because it suits his re-election better. So again, another difference there. Our Prime Minister appoints many important and powerful people within our political system, most notably and mentioned before, Supreme Court judges, but also something that we don't tend to see in the media are the all the bureaucrats who tend to house a lot of the knowledge about, the intricate knowledge about how these systems work. So there are some very powerful bureaucrats within our political system who are chosen by the Prime Minister and his office. And of course, as mentioned before, the Prime Minister chooses the cabinet. And also chairs that cabinet. But the main role of the Prime Minister is to set a legislative agenda. So to set an agenda for what he will do throughout the entirety of his term, or one parliamentary session at a time. And as mentioned, that takes us to cabinet. Now, if you're familiar with old television, Mr. T, you might have heard of the A-team. The cabinet is kind of like the Prime Minister's A-team. So there are over 300 people from 300 different areas of this country who get elected and who go to Ottawa to serve in representing their region. However, the Prime Minister chooses his favorites from that, however many winning, let's say, Liberals in this case there are, and forms a cabinet. And the responsibilities of that cabinet are as follows. They maintain that individual responsibility that they have as members of Parliament to represent their regions. But they also gain a portfolio. So a portfolio might be something like healthcare or Aboriginal affairs or the environment, So they gain that office, that specialty, and they head the ministry filled with many of those very important bureaucrats that's responsible for those issues. So those are their individual responsibilities, but they also have a collective responsibility. They're meant to be the faces of that government, and they speak in unity on all issues. So you may not be aware, but you as a citizen can make a request called a Freedom of Information request. You could say, I want a copy of every email Justin Trudeau ever sent where he mentioned Justin Bieber. And your government is responsible, although you have to pay a fee for the photocopies, is responsible to go and dig around and find all those emails for you because it's open. It should be open and accountable, so it's open access, this information. Not so with cabinet, though. The idea is that anything that happens behind closed doors with the cabinet and the prime minister is secret. And the reason for that is that very unity that I just mentioned. They need the opportunity to debate and argue and disagree with each other in a private context, so that they can come to some decisions and then show themselves as a united front. So that's a collective responsibility. So what does the cabinet do? Well, they make major decisions about how to spend taxpayers' money, about what laws they hope to pass, and they also make decisions about when those laws will be introduced into the legislature. They operate, obviously, the departments that they lead, like the Ministry of the Environment, for instance. And, of course, they provide that political leadership for the party, but not just the party, also the country. So that's the executive, the Canadian executive. It's comprised mainly of the Crown, the Prime Minister, his office, and the cabinet. Now, in order to answer the question of in which system there is more theoretical power, whether it's the Prime Minister within our system or the President within the U.S. Republic system, well, it is too difficult to have that conversation without first looking at the legislative system and how those two systems work differently. So we're going to leave that up to next week. Be sure to check out the reading guide questions and have a great day.